On the afternoon of January 24, 1865, the Smithsonian Institution building in Washington, D.C., the castle filled with smoke that did not belong to any laboratory. The fire began high, in the upper stories, where paper lived close to timber, correspondence, drawings, lecture notes, inventories that were never meant to be dramatic. In the official story, it is simply an accident in a young institution, a painful but ordinary hazard of gaslight and winter air, but the archive keeps a second story in its margins. After the flames, salvage pages were carried out damp and half-legible. Some titles survived only as soot-stained stubs. Some rooms were remembered more clearly than their contents. The record of loss is itself uneven, lists without lists, descriptions without the thing described. A museum can catalogue what it owns. It struggles to catalogue what it no longer has. Decades later, when newspaper readers search for proof that giants once stood where we stand, 10-foot bodies in mounds, impossible femurs, skulls that would not fit a modern hand, they often point to institutions like this one. They imagine a cabinet door closing. They imagine a ledger line erased. And in the absence left by fire, the imagination finds room. Somewhere below, water from buckets struck stone with a dull, bell-like thud, each impact a reminder that resonance outlives explanation. The visual anchor is small, a charred binding, a warped sheet of glass, the stain where a label once was. The official explanation says the castle burned and rebuilt, and knowledge continued. The contradiction is quieter. In the rebuilt rooms, the past is not restored, only replaced. History remembers progress, but forgets what it replaced. In the last light of that winter day, embers flickered behind blackened window frames, and the archive learned how easy it is for silence to look like deliberate design. By August 10, 1846, in Washington, D.C., the language of preservation was still more fragile than any wall. Congress created the Smithsonian Institution for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men, a phrase that reads like a national oath. Knowledge will be gathered, ordered, and shared. The official story begins with that sentence. A bequest is converted into an establishment. Private curiosity is meant to become public record. In early descriptions, the work is almost procedural: collect, classify, publish, and attempt to make memory systematic, as if history could be archived the way a specimen is boxed. The artifact anchor is the act itself, ink impressed into paper, diffusion sitting beside knowledge, as if information were a substance that could be poured without spilling. Yet even this founding document carries an archival tension that will matter later. The same text that promises knowledge also creates the authority to decide what counts as knowledge. The archive is built with gates, even when it calls itself a library. A human witness line in this chapter is legal rather than lyrical. The act speaks with many voices, offices, trustees, and signatures impersonal on purpose. Still, it pins a date to an intention. If a later viewer searches for giants erased from textbooks, this is where the accusation inevitably points, to the place that was designed to remember. The environmental element is August heat trapped in government rooms, the smell of fresh paper and sealing wax. Outside, the capital is still incomplete streets, scaffolds, raw masonry, an environment where it is easy to believe that objects can disappear between what is built and what is recorded. The contradictory timestamp is subtle. The Smithsonian is founded on a single day, yet its public identity forms over years, collections moving, buildings rising, catalogues stabilizing. A beginning can be legal long before it becomes visible. That gap is where later myths like to operate. The recurring acoustic motif enters quietly, the click and hum of wires in the city, a new infrastructure of signals. In a speculative reading, the hum becomes an omen. If knowledge can be diffused, it can also be filtered, and filters under the wrong light resemble erasures. In the archive, it was labelled permanent. In the world, it was built to change. On January 24, 1865, in Washington, D.C., The castle caught fire, and the Smithsonian learned what diffusion looks like when it is made of smoke. Contemporary and later Smithsonian accounts describe a blaze that destroyed much of the building's early work, including art, scientific specimens, the personal papers of James Smithson himself, and records of the institution's first decades. The official story is concise. The fire was catastrophic. The institution survived. Repairs followed. But a restored documentary would slow down and stay with the sensory evidence crackling above ceilings, ash drifting through corridors, the smell of scorched varnish, the dull impact of thrown water on stone. The repeating sound motif arrives here as a deadened bell note, buckets, emptied in a rhythm that feels like percussion, each strike an audible measurement of loss. The artifact anchor is an engraving and a diary page, one image that shows flames, one line of handwriting that shows time. Smithsonian materials preserve Mary Henry's eyewitness account, including the warning she was given. The building is in flames. You have but 5 minutes to save your property. A witness line does not need to be dramatic to be devastating. It only needs to be specific. The archival tension is documented and structural. After a fire, what remains is not simply less, but uneven collections, saved by chance, papers lost in one tower, while other rooms survive under brick vaulting. The archive becomes patchwork, and patchwork invites interpretation. Later readers can mistake gaps for intent. The environmental element is bitter winter, cold outside, and sudden furnace heat within, a seasonal contrast that makes the scene feel unreal. The recurring visual motif is flicker, flames in windows, then the flicker of gaslight in temporary repairs, then the flicker of scanned documents a century and a half later. The contradictory timestamp is built into the institution's own retelling. The fire is January 24, 1865, yet Smithsonian narratives note embers that smouldered for days before flames erupted. Time, here, is both instantaneous and slow, a hazard that accumulates invisibly and then declares itself in a single afternoon. A speculative observation bridges fact to the erasure theme without crossing the evidence line. When later internet claims insist that evidence of giants was destroyed by institutions, they often lean on real events like this fire, not because the fire proves suppression, but because it proves that records can vanish and leave no clean replacement. If history is written by survivors, who gets counted as a survivor? Objects, documents, or the silence between them? On October 16, 1869, in Cardiff, New York, workers digging a well uncovered what was presented as a petrified human body, the Cardiff giant. The official story is now clear, because the hoax is well documented, a carved gypsum figure planted to exploit religious literalism and public hunger for marvels. In the record, the giant is not an extinct species, it is a manufactured relic. Yet the camera would love the first hours of discovery. Dark soil gives way to pale stone, a tent is raised, admission is charged, men lean in with lanterns, and the crowd's breath hangs in autumn air. Newspapers turn the found object into national sensation. Telegraph lines, already humming, carry the phrase petrified giant beyond the county before anyone can test the material. The artifact anchor is the figure itself, gypsum dressed with scratches and stains to imitate time, posed as if sleep could fossilize. It becomes, paradoxically, a generator of authentic archives, a false object producing real documents. The contradiction is historically defensible and central to this title. An item can be fake and still leave a paper trail that lasts longer than the skepticism. A human witness line survives in reported reactions. One oft-repeated exclamation is attributed to a startled labourer. The exact wording varies across retellings, so the documentary treats it as reported speech rather than certified quotation. What matters is consistent. The men reacted as if they had struck something human, and that reaction became part of the spectacle. The environmental element is October earth cool, damp, adhesive clinging to stone and boots. The sound motif is the murmur of a crowd under canvas, the soft clink of coins, the staccato rattle of print presses. Underneath it, is the recurring electromagnetic motif, signal traffic, rumor traveling as vibration. The contradictory timestamp is built into the hoax's calendar. Later accounts place the burial in late November 1868 and the discovery in October 1869, nearly a year of staged antiquity. Exposure arrives in another winter timestamp, confession and court actions in December 1869 and February 1870. A giant can exist for months in public belief and then collapse in one day of print. A speculative observation emerges from the afterimage. If a society learns that giants can be fabricated for profit, it also learns to suspect that any genuine anomaly might be hidden for profit or ideology. Hoaxes do not only create skepticism, they also create conspiratorial reflex. Photographs fade into static. If history is written by survivors, who erase the rest? By May 24, 1844, inside the United States Capitol, in Washington, D.C., a four-word message crossed wire to Baltimore, Maryland. What hath God wrought? The official story treats the first long-distance telegraph message as a hinge in modern-time communication separating from transportation, information moving as electromagnetic pulse rather than as a carried letter. For this film, the telegraph is also an archival machine. It creates the conditions under which giants become repeatable, not by producing skeletons, but by producing templates. Once a single sensational account exists, the network can reproduce its cadence. Remarkable discovery, ancient mound, bones of extraordinary size across distant places with minimal verification. The artifact anchor is the message slip itself, preserved as a document that is simultaneously text and event. It is a small rectangle of paper that teaches the audience how myths travel, as compressed phrases, as quotable lines. The human witness line is therefore literal and historically fixed, the biblical wording, chosen for the moment, then endlessly repeated, like a ritual announcement of the signal age. The environmental element is spring air outside and warm metal inside, oil, varnished wood, and the faint tang of heated contacts. The sound motif begins as a click of the key and expands into the film's recurring hum wires singing with current, the same kind of vibration later audiences will associate with bells, domes, and harmonic architecture in alternative readings. The archival tension here is methodological rather than conspiratorial. Speed changes what survives. Newspapers learn to print first and correct later. Readers learn to trust the first impression. Archives, later, inherit a record saturated with initial errors and reprints. Many 19th century giant skeleton items are known to us, not through excavation logs, but through clippings, copied from paper to paper, until origin becomes hard to locate. The contradictory timestamp is the gap between transmission and permanence. The message is dated May 24, 1844, yet its cultural force arrives later as lines spread across continents. In countless later retellings, the date blurs, while the phrase remains sharp words surviving when the calendar fades. A speculative observation slides in without claiming proof. If older builders had once used resonance, induction, or other subtle forces as infrastructure, a 19th century wire world would interpret their remnants through its own metaphors: hum, current, transmission. The archive cannot demonstrate that hidden network. It can only show that the age of wires trained the public to think of invisible power as real. Meanwhile, another headline arrives, already louder than the correction that will follow. On December 7, 1869, in the New York Supreme Court, an injunction hearing over competing giants became part of the Cardiff Giants documentation. A Library of Congress legal history account notes that the case was heard before Justice Barnard, reported at the time by the Albany Evening Journal. 3 days later, on December 10, 1869, George Hull's confession to the press tightened the timeline of the deception, a year of staged antiquity collapsing into a winter burst of type. The official story frames this as closure, a hoax exposed, a lesson delivered. But The documentary treats the legal and journalistic paper trail as its own artifact evidence of how a society processes uncertainty. The artifact anchor is the court filing as reported and the newspaper column beside it. Law and publicity operating as parallel classification systems. A human witness line surfaces in the way the courtroom became theatre. One famous judicial quip, often paraphrased in later retellings, suggested that if a man wanted the court to certify his giant's authenticity, he should have the giant swear to it. Because the exact phrasing varies, the film treats it as historically attested humour rather than verbatim transcript. In the archive, even jokes have footnotes. The environmental element is early December cold, the city's coal smoke air, the hard light of winter on stone facades. The sound motif is paper on paper, petitions, printed columns, the soft percussion of documents stacking into record. The archival tension is that exposure does not erase belief, it reorganizes it. Some viewers learn skepticism, others learn that institutions can be fooled, and therefore might conceal. The rumor that a line like, "There's a sucker born every minute" emerged from this episode persists, but careful modern summaries treat its attribution as uncertain. That uncertainty is itself a lesson. The archive preserves misattributions as easily as it preserves facts. The contradictory timestamp is a layered calendar of endings. October 16, 1869 is discovery, December 7 is court, December 10 is confession. February 2, 1870 becomes, in many summaries, the day a judge declared competing giants to be fakes. Different audiences experience different endings, and the archive keeps them all. A speculative observation connects to the title's erasure claim without pretending to know motives. Once a culture has watched a giant be manufactured and litigated, it becomes easier for later storytellers to argue that any absence of giants in textbooks is not lack of evidence but institutional embarrassment. The film does not endorse that conclusion. It shows the mechanism by which it becomes emotionally satisfying. Voiceover continues over a stack of clippings, the edges browned, the ink still loud. In the winter of 1890, at Castelnau-les-Lez near Montpellier in southern France, the anthropologist Georges Vacher de la Puge reported unusually large human bone fragments from a burial tumulus. Later summaries note that he described these finds in the journal La Nature, and that the fragments were interpreted as belonging to a very tall individual. The official story here is careful, because the primary artifact is mediated through publication. We do not hold the body, we hold the report. The artifact anchor is therefore double, the bones as measured objects, and the printed page that turns measurement into claim. A single long fragment, femur-like, tibia-like, invites a body in the mind, and the mind supplies what the tray cannot hold. A human witness line is present in Lapuge's posture rather than in a safely quotable sentence. In later retellings, his stance is described as insistence that the fragments were human despite their size. The documentary paraphrases that insistence as a historically attested remark, not as a dramatic declaration. In a restoration report, certainty is often expressed as method, comparison, measurement, classification. The environmental element is winter excavation, damp soil, cold hands, iron tools ringing lightly when they strike stone. That ring becomes the chapter's sound motif, thin at first, then echoing into later chapters about bells and domes, where scale becomes audible. The archival tension is documented in the way this case survives. The find is cited, the measurements are repeated, the sensational summary giant travels further than the technical caveats. The archive preserves enough to keep the story alive, but not enough to settle it beyond dispute. It is an ideal seed for later erasure narratives, a printed anomaly with incomplete follow-through. The contradictory timestamp is not only when, but how long. Secondary references say winter 1890, while later discussions place renewed attention in the early 1890s, or even 1894, when other claims of unusually large skulls in the Montpellier region were circulated. The viewer is left with a timeline that expands as it is retold. the same few measurements stretched across years of commentary. A speculative observation bridges fact and myth without presenting it as proof. Alternative interpretations treat such cases as biological echoes of a built environment that already seems scaled for larger bodies, oversized doors, towering staircases, monumental halls. Official history offers more mundane explanations for scale: industrial transport, ceremonial architecture, structural necessity. The documentary holds both possibilities in frame, but keeps the audience anchored to what is actually attested: fragments, print, and the stubborn fact that the record is incomplete. Dust drifts across the page, as if the measurement itself were still settling. In 1894, in Washington, D.C., the Bureau of Ethnology's long Mound investigation effort crystallized into a major publication: Cyrus Thomas's report on the Mound explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology. In the official story, the report helps close a 19th century debate by arguing that the earthen mounds of the United States were built by the ancestors of Native American peoples, not by a vanished race of mound builders. The work is framed as method replacing speculation. The artifact anchor is a government-bound volume maps, site descriptions, measured profiles of earthworks classification as an instrument of closure. This is how institutions end myths, not with a single dramatic rebuttal, but with pages of field notes and comparative reasoning, slow enough to feel like erosion. A human trace appears in administrative origin stories. Smithsonian archival descriptions note that John Wesley Powell established a division of mound explorations in 1882, under instruction of Congress, to discover the true origin of the mounds. Yet later bibliographic summaries sometimes place the division's establishment in 1881. That one-year discrepancy is small, but it illustrates the documentary's central anxiety. Even institutional timelines can blur at the edges. The environmental element is office dryness and dust paper climates rather than weather. The sound motif is static, pages turning like faint radio crackle, a story being tuned from the sensational to the measurable. The archival tension is not an uncovered scandal, it is a documented shift in what gets preserved. Before this era, many mound-related claims circulated through local newspapers and private collecting. After this era, the record increasingly means official surveys and museum curation. When later audiences say giants were erased, what they often experience is this transition: unverified newspaper marvels falling out of textbooks as archaeology professionalized. The contradictory timestamp is therefore interpretive as well as factual. A mound may contain layers built over centuries. A report bears a single publication year. To a headline reader, that year feels like a decree. To an archaeologist, it is merely a binding around, slow fieldwork. A human witness line, here, is restrained and institutional, less a quote than a stance. The report's existence implies a claim that careful excavation and comparison can answer what rumor cannot. The documentary respects that claim while noting its emotional cost. Closure can feel like loss. A speculative observation leans toward the alternative framework without asserting it. Alternative interpretations treat the mounds and the giant stories attached to them as fragments of a deeper, globally connected engineering past earthworks, aligned like circuitry, landscapes designed for resonance. Official archaeology sees cultural continuity and human labor. The film allows the viewer to feel why the alternative reading is seductive, while remaining anchored to the documented pivot, method replacing marvel. In the archive, the builders are named, if history is written by survivors who erased the rest. On May 1, 1851, in Hyde Park, London, the Great Exhibition opened inside Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace, an iron and glass hall so vast that contemporaries struggled for language and reached for myth. Palace, cathedral, greenhouse, machine. The official story celebrates industrial modernity, a temporary structure built quickly, filled with objects from across an empire. The artifact anchor is architectural, ribbed iron, repeating panes, a building that looks less like masonry and more like a diagram, made inhabitable. Here, giant is not biological but structural. A 19th century city builds an enclosure large enough to contain trees, crowds, and whole categories of progress. A human witness line is preserved less as a single famous quotation than as a chorus of contemporary descriptions. Newspapers and guidebooks repeatedly emphasize scale and light. Visitors describe the interior as overwhelming, a place where sound diffused into a constant murmur. Because we avoid inventing specific named sentences, the film paraphrases the common report. People felt small inside a structure that made them feel measured. The environmental element is London's spring pale sunlight diffused through glass, rain threatening but held at bay by the roof. The sound motif is the hum of crowds under a resonant shell, the soft thunder of footsteps on flooring, the way the building turns voices into a continuous acoustic haze. The archival tension here is minimal, and the records are consistent. The exhibition is heavily documented in images, catalogues, and press. The mystery therefore arises not from missing documents, but from interpretation. Why did the 19th century repeatedly build spaces that look like they were designed for larger beings? Official answers exist. Engineering opportunity, public spectacle, the logic of mass display. The contradictory timestamp is one of memory rather than record. The exhibition opens on May 1, 1851, yet many later viewers remember the Crystal Palace less as an event than as an object that always existed, a permanent symbol. In fact, it was moved and resited, its meaning changing with its location and afterlife. A structure can be temporary and still feel like an era's backbone. A speculative observation connects this giant architecture to alternative hypotheses without claiming proof. Alternative readings treat the Crystal Palace and similar iron halls as echoes of a unified design, intelligence architecture, built as resonant instrument, glass and iron tuned for light and vibration. Official history sees modular construction and industrial aesthetics. The documentary holds the two readings in parallel, one technical, one esoteric, both responding to the same evidence: scale. Across the continent, another hall rises with the same ribs, as if the decade itself were copying a blueprint of scale. On May 10, 1876, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the Centennial Exposition opened, and the United States staged its own cathedral of industry. The official story is national self-definition, machines and inventions displayed as proof of progress, 100 years after independence. The artifact anchor is mechanical and auditory, the great Corliss steam engine in Machinery Hall, a device so large that visitors described it in the language of awe rather than specification. Its flywheel and pistons were not merely seen, they were felt vibration transmitted through flooring, a low, steady pulse that made the building itself seem alive. A human witness line is historically attested in the form of contemporary reactions recorded in press and memoir. Rather than risk invented phrasing, the documentary paraphrases the common report. Visitors gathered to watch the engine start, and many described the sound as overwhelming, an industrial roar that carried the authority of power. The film treats that roar as a repeating motif. The same hum that telegraph wires carried as signal now appears as mechanical resonance, a physics of modernity. The environmental element is late spring heat and coal smoke haze, sunlight catching on polished metal. The sound motif is persistent, the rhythmic thump of machinery, and the surrounding crowd's quieter breath, as if human bodies were tuning themselves to the engine's tempo. The archival tension is not a missing photograph. It is a conceptual contradiction that is documented in the era's language. The exposition framed machinery as liberation, yet it also displayed the scale at which humans become attendants to systems larger than themselves. In a film about giants erased, this matters because it shows how the 19th century was already building giants, mechanical giants, and teaching the public to stand in their shadow. The contradictory timestamp is the way the exposition fixes a year 1876, while the technologies it displayed were products of earlier experiments and would echo into later infrastructure. The centennial is a punctual celebration. The industrial transformation is not punctual at all. Viewers later remember a machine as emblem, not as a specific day's demonstration. A speculative observation bridges to alternative interpretations. Alternative readers sometimes suggest that certain exhibition machines and power displays resemble a rediscovered energy tradition, resonance, induction, harmonics rather than a straightforward industrial lineage. Official histories place the Corliss engine firmly in known steam engineering. The documentary does not rewrite that lineage. It notes the sensation that fuels alternative hypotheses. When a machine is large enough to be felt through the body, it begins to resemble a force of nature, and nature invites myth. Dust drifts over gears in old photographs. The hum still seems to come through the paper. By May 6, 1889, in Paris on the Champ de Mars, the Exposition Universelle opened beneath a new skyline, and the Eiffel Tower stood as a skeletal announcement of modern engineering. The official story is celebrated and familiar. Iron becomes monument. A World's Fair becomes a testbed for structural audacity. The artifact anchor is architectural ironwork lattice that appears delicate up close and impossibly strong at distance, a form that makes the city look temporarily inhabited by a larger species. For this film, Paris shows giant as design, scale as statement. A human witness line exists as documented opposition. Prominent artists and writers protested the tower's presence, framing it as an intrusion into the city's aesthetic order. The film paraphrases the protest's tone rather than invent a named quote. They saw the tower as monstrous, an industrial chimney masquerading as beauty. Their resistance is a human trace in the record, a reminder that progress is never unanimously received. The environmental element is early summer Paris. Bright light on iron, wind climbing the structure, dust and river humidity moving through crowds. The sound motif is wind whistle through lattice, and the distant clang of construction, an acoustic reminder that metal is never silent. The archival tension is interpretive. The tower is documented, the exposition is photographed, the records are consistent. The mystery arises from the cultural afterimage. Why do so many later lost civilization narratives point to the same decade's monumental iron and stone as evidence of a unified, semi-erased design intelligence? Official history answers with patents, engineering schools, labor, and finance. The alternative reading answers with pattern. The contradictory timestamp appears in how the tower's meaning changes across time. In 1889, it is temporary in intent. Later, it becomes emblem, preserved, reused, reinterpreted. A structure can begin as exhibition and end as symbol. That shift is not an erasure, but it is a reclassification. A speculative observation connects the tower's resonance to alternative motifs without asserting proof. Alternative interpretations treat iron monuments and glass halls as components of an older harmonic system architecture, as antennae, domes and towers, as tuned instruments for energy and communication. Official physics and engineering do not require that hypothesis, but the documentary notes why it persists. A tower is literally a structure built to stand in air, to catch wind, to catch signal, to make the invisible feel plausible. Across oceans, the same decade builds other towers and halls. The pattern repeats, like a signal seeking a receiver. On May 1, 1893, in Chicago, Illinois, the world's Columbian Exposition opened, and the White City presented itself as a temporary civilization. Boulevards, domes, classical facades, electric light reflected in water. The official story is urban spectacle and technological display, an engineered dream built to be visited and then dismantled. The artifact anchor is the exposition's architecture itself, monumental facades, vast halls, and the interplay of water and illumination. For a film about giants, this is where scale becomes ambiguous. A human witness line is preserved through contemporary descriptions of the fair's lighting and atmosphere. Without inventing named sentences, the documentary paraphrases a common reaction. People describe the electric illumination and the reflective lagoons as uncanny, as if the city were lit from within. That uncanny glow becomes a repeating motif flicker transformed into steady light, like an archive finally exposed. The environmental element is Chicago spring shifting into humid summer, lake air, dust from construction, the smell of fresh plaster. The sound motif is the low roar of crowds, and, beneath it, the mechanical hum of generators' electricity as audible presence. The recurring electromagnetic motif becomes literal here, currents powering a city that exists for a season. The archival tension is partly documented and partly structural. The fair was meant to be temporary, yet its images and design language proved durable. Official records explain its materials and its demolition. The erasure feeling enters because demolition produces absence that photographs cannot fully explain. When later alternative researchers point to impossible old-world buildings and claim they were removed, the exposition becomes their prime exhibit not because its removal is hidden, but because it dramatizes how quickly monumentality can turn into vacancy. The contradictory timestamp is the slippage between opening day and afterlife. The exposition opens May 1, 1893. Many of its most famous features, like the Ferris wheel, become fully operational later, while the fair's ruins and fires shape the memory afterward. A single date begins a story that the public remembers through later scenes. A speculative observation links Chicago's domes and towers to the alternative frame without claiming it as history. Alternative readings treat the fair's domes and symmetrical waterways as echoes of a global design grammar architecture, as resonant instrument, water as conductor, light as proof of a lost energy system. Official history attributes the effect to late 19th century electrical engineering and neoclassical planning. The documentary stays with the evidence, but lets the viewer feel the pull of the alternative. When a city appears fully formed and then disappears, it resembles a recovered memory more than a construction project. In the archive, it was labeled temporary. In stone light photographs, it looks built to last. In May 2014, in the online afterworld, where old headlines are reborn without their corrections, a story circulated claiming that the Smithsonian had admitted to destroying thousands of giant skeletons in the early 1900s. The official fact, as later documented by professional fact-checking, is that this claim originated on a website that labeled its content satirical and fictional. The admission was not real. The artifact anchor in this chapter is digital, a screenshot styled to resemble archival authority, a manipulated image of oversized bones, a paragraph written to sound like leaked institutional confession. This is the modern counterpart to the Cardiff giant, a manufactured object producing real documents, shares, reposts, outraged commentary, and archive made of replication. A human witness line arrives as a modern paraphrase of institutional response. The Smithsonian is repeatedly asked to address the claim. Fact-checkers record that the institution did not make such an admission. Here, the witness is not an excavator, but a communications clarification paperwork in a new medium. The environmental element is not weather, but interface. Blue light in a dark room, the faint buzz of a phone, the quiet click of refresh. The sound motif is static again, now literal. Compression artifacts, glitchy images, audioless footage that still feels noisy. The archival tension is stark and documented in our moment. Digital platforms preserve the sensational claim more efficiently than they preserve the correction. Erasure, here, is not a secret committee, it is an attention economy. A story can be debunked and still remain more alive than the truth. The contradictory timestamp is built into the claim itself. It points to early 1900s as the era of alleged destruction, while the story's actual origin is 2014, with periodic resurges years later. The timeline is a hallucination created by style, modern text wearing old clothing. When viewers feel that giants were erased from history books, what they may be sensing is this temporal mask, new invention masquerading as old record. A speculative observation reframes the meaning of erasure for the documentary's close. If there were genuine anomalies in the historical record, unusual bones, unexplained architecture, contradictions left unresolved, then the modern hoax ecosystem becomes an additional veil. It does not prove suppression. It overwhelms the signal with noise, making careful inquiry harder. Photographs fade into static, and the real ends in a room full of screens. each one insisting it is an archive. On August 4, 2022, the giant story returned in a new form. A Reuters fact-check traced the recurring claim about the Smithsonian destroying giant skeletons back to its satirical origin, and noted that the institution had not made such an admission. The official story is a modern footnote, verification applied to a viral narrative, a correction issued. The artifact anchor is the fact-check itself, contemporary journalism functioning like an index card in a chaotic library. It names the mechanism: satire mislabeled as revelation, edited images treated as excavation photographs, anonymous posts treated as institutional record. A human witness line, in the spirit of this film, is understated. Fact-checking language is procedural, originated on, identifies its content as the modern equivalent of an archivist's margin note. It is a human trace that refuses drama, and that refusal is part of its credibility. The environmental element is the quiet of office light and browser tabs, the faint hum of a computer fan. The sound motif returns as a thin electronic buzz, today's version of the telegraph click information moving instantly again, but now with the weight of correction attached. The archival tension here is the documentary's final contradiction. Institutions and journalists can document what is false, can trace provenance, can publish corrections, and yet the feeling of erasure persists, because the emotional narrative of lost giants is not sustained by evidence alone, but by the visible fact that archives are incomplete, fires happened, reports replaced rumors, and images can be made to look older than they are. The contradictory timestamp closes the circle. The claim points vaguely to the early 1900s. The correction is dated precisely August 4, 2022. Between them is more than a century of changing media, from telegraph to newspaper to exhibition catalogue to screenshot. The giant's story survives by adapting its container. A speculative observation offers the final, careful synthesis without claiming a revelation. Perhaps what is being erased is not a literal race of giants, but a certain mode of reading the past, the willingness to sit with unanswered measurements, to notice repeating architectural grammars, to hear resonance in stone and iron, and wonder whether design memory travels farther than documented lineage. Official history, rightly, insists on evidence. Alternative readings insist, more quietly, on pattern. Between them is a space where careful viewers can remain curious without becoming credulous. In the last frame, a digitized diary page from 1865 flickers on screen, then dissolves into a modern feed. The same human impulse is visible in both, to save what can be saved before the smoke or the noise takes it. If history is written by survivors, who teaches the survivors how to read the ruins?